As we all know, our churches are made up of both men and women. However, men seem to often be the only ones that do the significant things of ministry in your church. And if you want that to be different, well, this episode is for you, as we are going to share 5 ways that you can encourage women in leadership at your church.
Thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. We're going to be giving you 5 ways to encourage women in leadership at your church.
And real quick, before we jump into that, we'll share with you this episode's sponsor, which is Faith Street. Faith Street is for pastors and communities that feel scattered, worn out, and frayed. And if you're wondering what church looks like in 2020 and beyond because of the pandemic, Faith Street is here to help. Faith Street is a new kind of mobile app for churches focused on discipleship and community, not just communication. So it's different than a stereotypical church app. It strengthens people's commitment to the church and each other, builds community by prompting prayer, generosity, reflection, fellowship, and teaching as daily practices. Faith Street is led by a team with roots in the Assemblies of God, Vineyard, PCA, Anglican, and non-denominational worlds. And it's built by leaders and for leaders. So if you want more information about Faith Street, you should go to faithstreet.com/practical, because Practical Church Planting listeners, which is you, or watchers if you're watching us on YouTube.
That's right.
Can receive 20% off. faithstreet.com/practical for questions, answers, and even a discount. That's where you'll want to head.
Nice.
So today's episode, 5 ways to encourage women in leadership at your church. This is kind of regardless of theological convictions, what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of us, I think, would say we want to make sure women are involved. They are over 50% of most churches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what does it look like to practically do this, especially if you're a man, you're a pastor? Most of our audience is predominantly male.
Right.
And so what can we do, if that's you, to encourage women to take steps of leadership and ownership in your church, which I'm sure everybody wants.
Yes.
And you might just be wondering, what do I actually do? So that's what this episode's for. The first thing we would recommend and advise is to ask women to fill needed roles. Whatever the psychological studies and stuff that they do, they just show that women are much less likely to ask for a raise. They're much less likely to ask, whatever. I don't know how all the psychology stuff in it, but it's men are more likely to just go and try to take what they want, and women are less likely to do that. And so especially if you're a man, if you're a leader, you're a pastor, and you want women to step up, and you might be wondering, well, men seem to say when they're interested in doing ministry and that, but women don't seem to say it. And so you might assume, because you might be more forthright, that you would say something. If nobody's saying anything, it's because nobody wants to do it. We would say psychologically, it could be that a woman wants to do something, but they feel like they shouldn't do it unless they're asked.
Yeah.
But also, I think a lot of people, women and men, but especially women, might not feel like ministry is something that they do or are supposed to do or can do. Even in our church today, we've got staff and serve positions where people are filled with people who probably initially never thought they'd be in ministry. Because a lot of people think ministry is just like the senior pastor who preaches every Sunday.
Yeah.
And ministry is a lot bigger than that. And so if you see gifted women who are doing a great job, or if you have needs in your church, express them and ask women if they're interested in doing it. And don't just assume that they'll say, hey, I want to do this, because a lot of times, women just honestly have been taught or been told that they don't do quote unquote ministry, even though they would do a really good job in any various position.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that especially if you've been around for a while, if you've planted, and not even years, but if you've planted and maybe have a staff of 1 or 2 or a few, and you don't have any women on staff, you may unintentionally be sending a message that women that this isn't a church for women to do ministry in. Yeah. Not that you're saying that, or not that you're really even doing that. It is entirely possible that that's just kind of how the chips fell, is you only had men that were interested in the very beginning. It's not like a fault of your own, especially at the beginning, but that may be the message that's coming across. And so being clear that when needs come up that you see a woman in your church that could fill, approaching them and not waiting for them to approach you, like Dylan was saying, I think is really wise. And especially if you have that kind of male staff dynamic or male heavy staff dynamic, and you want to figure out a way to break out of that, I think this is how you're going to have to do it.
Yeah.
I don't think you're gonna. I don't think. I think you're gonna be waiting a long time if you just say I'm waiting until a woman comes and says she wants to join your staff team.
Yeah.
I think that's gonna be tough.
Yeah, so finding ways again to say if you see something in somebody to offer them, and not even it doesn't even have to be like a staff position too. It could be like a serve team position.
Totally,
You know,
yeah.
it's like you need leaders to lead serve teams or lead capacities or whatever. Actually, being intentional about asking them, hey, I've seen this. Are you interested in this? They might not have even thought that's something they could do, but give them some time, and they're like, actually, no, I guess I can do this, and I do enjoy it. And so part of it is just not just waiting for women to say, hey, I want to do this, but being intentional when you see gifted women to say, hey, I could see you doing this role, stepping into this position. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think it's I'd encourage you to look outside of the stereotypical women positions. Not that it's a bad thing to, obviously, if you need kids ministry ran and you see someone who's very passionate about it, to ask them about it, but to have that not be the only thing. And we got a few examples to give as we move on in this episode, but whether it's just kind of more like hospitality related things, or like for example, last year 2020, we do every 4th of July, we do a Q&A Sunday.
Yeah.
Actually, every year we've done this, actually, not just last year. But one of the things is we always make sure there's a woman on stage. The first year, it was Dylan's wife, Christina. Last year, we had a woman that was just in our congregation who we felt would be a good addition to the kind of panel that we do for the Q&A, and she was. But that may not have been something that someone would have assumed they would have been qualified for, I guess. So that would have been us having to approach them saying, we would like you to do this. But it's not necessarily the stereotypical
kids ministry.
Kids are worship. Kids are worship,
kids are worship.
And so look for opportunities outside of that, and they will arise, and look for people that can help fill them.
Yeah, so I mean, if you need help leading hospitality, organizing your community groups and who's being in there, events, I mean, a lot of stuff. It's not. It doesn't just have to be kids, worship, or administrative.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of things you could do. Again, I know there's different theological convictions, but we're not talking about preaching, if that's a thing. We're not talking about eldership. Like I think most people would agree, no matter where you fall on commentarian, egalitarian, whatever, the majority of things in a church, men and women can do.
Right.
But
Yeah.
For various reasons, a lot of it's just done by men. And so if there's someone that you see skilled and that's good, like, do it, and don't, like, I don't know, maybe there's like a fear of what people will think, whatever. Just like invite them into it, be intentional, and ask women to fill needed positions. Don't just assume that they'll say, hey, I want to do it, because they might not even assume. Just like a lot of people will think that, well, I'm not qualified for that, even though they are.
Yeah, so. And that's a good point. Like, we're talking about women in this episode, but this goes for anybody, really. Like, there's a lot of people that may want to maybe not do ministry vocationally, but want to be a lot more involved, but just have no clue what that looks like because they don't feel qualified. And so in this specific example, we're talking about women, but this goes across the board of if you see someone that you see something in that could fill a role, or that you see as exceptionally like passionate about a specific thing, give them more opportunities to do that thing. Like, help them lean into that. And that may not turn out to be like vocational ministry, but it may just turn out to be someone who's very heavily involved lay leader for the rest of their life, which is just as good.
I mean, this is just a good principle for ministry. Don't just assume your church is going to grow. Don't just assume your church is going to improve financially. Like, you should be intentional about having a plan of what I'm going to do. And so asking women to fill needed roles instead of just assuming, well, hopefully one day someone will show up. And you should hopefully it's like a desire of yours as well. If it's not a desire, it's not going to happen. But don't just let it be a desire. Like, try to do some things to encourage women to take steps in your church.
Yeah, that's good.
So that's the first one, ask women to fill needed roles. Number 2, have a woman on stage every Sunday. This can be a really helpful thing as you try to say, hey, this isn't just like a man-run church and organization.
Right.
Now, again, I know there could be, depending on how many people you have in the band and all, like that might be difficult to do. But if you set it as a goal, and you're not hitting the goal, you'll begin to think of practical things to actually make that goal happen, as to say, well, it would just be nice. Yeah. So, people, on the band, people that we call it next steps, or doing announcements. I mean, we have a band and someone doing next steps every week.
Yep.
And trying to be intentional of like, hey, we want to make sure that there's a woman platformed. So if you don't have any women in your band, well, then you should train some people to do next steps. Yeah. Or vice versa. It's just like encouraging, If you have women that are good, gifted musicians, it might not assume that they're supposed to play or they can play. And not just because they're women, but a lot of people just think like ministry is like you have to be certain qualified and go to school or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But having women on stage, having a representation shows that men and women are welcome to do things at this church.
Yeah, and this ties sort of back into the first point that it's unlikely that you're going to have many women come up and just say, I want to do these specific things, but it's way more unlikely if they don't even see a woman in any sort of like, I don't even want to say prominent role, but any sort of like role in the church. Like if they never see a woman on stage, then I mean, I wouldn't ask to be more involved in the church. You know, if I never saw if I would just assume that's not something that this church does, you know, and not that you would ever say that, but if it's only strictly men ever on stage, then you can't blame a woman for not coming up to you and saying, hey, I want to do something on stage, because that's not something that is even a thing in your church, whether that's intentional or not. And so, yeah, having a woman on stage every Sunday, and as much as possible, I know, like, you know, we have things that we want to do and things that are realistic for us to do based on church size. So if possible, not the same person. So in other words, if your worship director is a woman, great, they're probably on stage most Sundays, but it'd be great to get someone else. So it's not only necessarily the same one woman on stage every Sunday. And I get like church size, staff size, volunteer size, that all plays into it. So that may be something to work towards, but especially if you do something like announcements and next steps, that's the easiest thing to plug someone into, because you don't need to have any any talents or anything beforehand. That's something you can learn and do pretty much from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I would recommend. I mean, announcements are really awkward and boring, and I would tell you they do not have to be. So like, make sure you're giving them feedback and that sort of thing. But if your church has more women than men, or at least 50-50, you should have plenty of options to do that. And so I would encourage you, like, have someone to do especially if you're a church plant or small, even if you're in the launch phase, just have someone share, ask some women to do it and have them do the next steps or the giving, or if you do like confession in your service or certain liturgical elements, giving them the space to do that will help, again, people see, oh, this is not just men.
And I think that's good. And that's stuff that someone doesn't have to be great at from the beginning. You know, you obviously have to give feedback, or else it will not be great in most cases. Like, not everyone is, has that, I don't know if talent's the right word, whatever, of like doing it from the get-go without any feedback, because it does it can come across really boring and stiff. But if you're willing to give feedback and let people kind of grow into it, then it's a very easy place to plug people into. And you'd be surprised, I think, how many people are willing to get up on stage that you wouldn't think would.
Yeah. Yep, totally agree. So have women on stage every Sunday if you can. I know church size can make it difficult and who you have, but if it's a goal, then you'll try to be strategic about making that happen. So number 3, get feedback from women on your sermons. And you could do this both before and or after you preach.
Yes.
So, at New City, we've shared this in various episodes, kind of the sermon writing process, but basically I talk through my sermon with the staff, which we have a woman. We've always, a woman on staff, 2 women on staff, but one of them is there. It doesn't matter. A woman hears my sermon every week before it's preached. And of course, I'm married, and so my wife gives feedback after. And I would encourage you not to let that just be the default.
Yeah.
Especially because your wife, though she may be honest and helpful, she's also like going to be on your team and wants you to do well. And people in your church want you to do well too, but they might be more likely to be honest. Like, that didn't make sense, or I don't understand. And so I would encourage, if you're married, that don't let your wife be the only one.
Yes.
Although you should ask her if you have no one else. But like, that's helpful ahead of time. And so a woman hears it and can say, and there's been times where it's like, I wouldn't say that, or that doesn't make sense, or here's like a female example. And maybe you don't have someone in the moment where you don't work through your sermons with anyone ahead of time. I would have a couple women on, at your church and ask them, if you give me feedback, and let them know it's not just because you want people to give feedback. Like, you want women's perspectives. And so it's not like, hey, please, if you're able, it's like, no, I need your help. And when you ask people, I did this too, and not just women, but like when we started New City, I wanted feedback from people. Certain people, I would have to email them every week, because people forget and they might feel bad, and they have to actually know that you want it. So it's not, you can't just ask one time and then expect. You're probably going to have to ask a lot of times before it's like a normal thing. But have a structure of getting feedback from women either before or after you preach, so that like, are you connecting well to both people, or are you only speaking to men, only using examples that men can connect with all the time?
Yeah, that's really good. And that's what I was talking about earlier. There's a lot of things that you can involve people in that aren't necessarily staff or classic ministry things. And this is one of them. Like you can get people involved in the sermon writing process, like we do, like collabing on a message. But that might be a little bit tougher with schedules, especially if you're a smaller team. But getting people's feedback after the fact is very easy. I would say, I mean, maybe this goes without saying, but make sure they know that they're expected to give feedback. In other words, like ask them before the message that you're asking, not
Right.
afterwards. And ask like what that, and this might take a few minutes for you to kind of figure out in your mind, but ask them, like, be specific in what sort of feedback you want. In other words, like, don't just say I'd like feedback on my message, because that means nothing. That means good or bad. Like, but what kind of feedback? Like Dylan said, were my examples very masculine focused, or were you able to connect with them? Or if you were new, would you get the sense that that I was preaching to men and women and not just men? It's very specific things that they can then look for in your message, instead of just saying, I would like feedback from a woman's perspective, because if they've never done that, doesn't really give them a framework of what to work from.
I read this recently, and I thought this was really helpful. If you're for sermon, really for feedback for anything, but we're talking about sermon feedback. This could be for men or for women, but also, obviously, in this case, we're talking about women and making them feel like they can give you like honest feedback. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, people feel bad giving a leader feedback because they don't want to get in trouble or whatever. And so I was reading something. It was talking about, like, for sermon feedback, you could use this. You could ask a group of people, like if you're a church on staff, you could ask your staff, how was the sermon? Everyone's going to say good, because people, what you should say instead, on a scale of 1 to 10, what was, how would you rate the sermon? Nobody's going to give you a 10, because people just don't do that.
Yeah.
If they give you an 8 or a 9, then you can then say, what could I have done to have made that a 10? And then you'll get an answer, because people aren't going to give you a 10.
Yeah.
And even if they give you a 9, that means, well, there was something.
Yeah.
And so it might be able to say, you could say things like, how did this connect, as like from a woman's perspective? Was there any illustrations or whatever that were helpful or unhelpful? Not that everything is going to be helpful for men and women, but on a scale, and say like on a scale of 1 to 10, how relatable was this 1 to 10? How much did you understand 1 to 10? Like, give them maybe 3 specific questions, and you could do the scale or not, maybe in the beginning, to help encourage people to give you feedback. Yeah. But yeah, like Brian said, let them know ahead of time. Ask them specifically, what could I have done to connect better? But include women in the feedback of your sermons, either before or after.
And I would say do it. I mean, obviously get their, ask if they're interested. But if they are, tell them that you'd like this like regularly. Like maybe not every week. That might be a little much unless they want to do it, but maybe monthly or something like that. Because I think it'll take some time to get. It may, for certain people, it may take some time to get more honest feedback. Yeah. In other words, so we do message collabing here. All the staff gets together and collaborates on messages. And I remember early in New City days, like at the very beginning, I may have talked about this in here before, but like I was hesitant to give much feedback because I was one of the only ones on staff who didn't go to seminary. Mm-hmm. So I was like, I was hesitant to say anything, because I was like, I don't want to look stupid if I just understand something different. But also, like, I just assumed, like, for those that had been, whether it's doing this longer or just that I felt were more educated in this area than me, that they would know, like, if I didn't understand something, it was more that, like, they understood and I didn't. And it was more my issue than anything. Which now, like, I realize that's not always the case, but that may be something that you come up against if asking someone who's not necessarily, seminary educated or spent their entire life in church to do this. It may take some time before they actually are willing to give you criticism. Yeah. And honestly, that's what none of us are doing everything great. So you don't want feedback that you did a great job and that's it, without anything to work on. So ask them to do this, but also ask them if you'd be willing to do this on a however often works for you, but on a semi-regular basis, so we can kind of develop this feedback relationship that'll grow over time. And
it'll help you in the future too. Like, I'll give you a really honest feedback. I mean, again, mostly men are listening to this, so this would be good to know, because it's good for me to know. The first year or two of New City, I don't know what the sermon is about. Referenced Isaiah, where it talks about our good works are like filthy rags or whatever. And it's obviously talking about a woman's menstrual cycle or whatever. And I don't know how I said it, and I explained it and how it came across, and I had a woman tell me, like, I get what you're trying to say, but women aren't necessarily like excited, like, yes, I'm on my period, this is great. Like, especially in our culture, there can be shame to it and that sort of thing. And so she was just like, how you explain it, like, it made me feel bad that I was a woman, And it's like, I'm not a man. It was just really helpful. Yeah. And if I hadn't gotten that feedback, the next time I did it, literally, honestly, it would probably always come across that way. If a woman hadn't told me. And that's it. And that was just so helpful because like people use that illustration all the time.
Yeah.
And without being sensitive to it, because as a guy, you're just like, whatever about it.
Yeah.
That's what's being thought. So get feedback from women before or after.
That's interesting.
That's a particular example.
Yeah.
Number 4, be flexible with working hours. So if you want women on staff and you want mothers on staff who have different good perspectives, but different because there are different seasons of life, there should be this expectation, there should be flexibility in getting stuff done. This is not a flexible with expectations. It's working hours. Like people, if they're on staff, people need to do what they're doing full-time, part-time, whatever their expectations are, need to stay the same. But like where and how and when they do it, there has to be flexibility. Like this hasn't been, like we haven't come across this issue. I remember reading about this a couple of years ago, a woman who was on staff and she was full-time. And so she either had a baby or whatever. And her pastor said, basically, you get as much maternity leave as you want and come back when you're ready. She got like 6 months or whatever. It was paid. I get not all churches can do that.
Right.
But she said when she came back, she's like, I will never, I don't exactly know what her staff position was, but she's like, I'll never work for another church again in my life. Just because she's like, I felt valued. I felt like cared
never
about
worked
me.
for a different church?
Yeah, for another different church.
Okay,
She's like, I'm here. Like, I'm loyal.
Yeah.
Like, I was supported in that. And so, yeah, it might be staff meeting, might not be when you want it, or certain things might have to be moved around. But you have to have that flexibility if you want women to work on staff. Part of the reason men, like, maybe we're making people mad. I don't know. Like, my opinion, it is unrealistic to assume that you're going to have a 50-50 split between men and women on your staff. I just don't, because that's not the workforce. Women stay home with their kids more than men do, and you could say that's just tradition, and we need to break that. Part of that's tradition. Part of that is, generally speaking, in my anecdotal experience, women want to stay home with their kids more than men want to. Like, so I would expect to have more, like at New City, I always will expect, if this changes, great.
Yeah.
But I have no expectation to be 50-50 men and women,
Right.
like long-term at New City, because I know there's a lot of other dynamics at play. But if you want to have women on your staff, you've got to have the flexibility to allow them to do what they need to do while also being on staff, because the feedback that they give you is valuable. And what they do is really valuable. And so just be flexible with that if you want women to have leadership and staffing roles at your church.
Yeah, that's really good. So just a little peek behind the curtain for New City. We don't have specific, how do I put this? We don't require people to clock in, clock out. I'll say, we have times that we basically like have sat down with each individual person and developed a schedule. So we know when everyone's working, but we don't say everyone has to be here X hour to X hour.
Yeah.
And I know people agree and people disagree with that. But honestly, I feel like if you, especially as like a church plant, like as a not established thing, if you decide that you want to have office hours of this, I mean, I'm sure no one's thinking like 8 to 5 for 40 hours, but like whatever times, you will inherently exclude a chunk of the population from being able to work for you, and regardless of what that time period is. And so being flexible, especially in the early stages, I think is really important. It's tough because collaboration is good. So having people be able to work together is a good thing. But I don't think it's worth. I think it's worth sacrificing a little bit of collaboration, especially nowadays that we can communicate at the touch of a button at any period, to be able to open yourself up to a larger demographic in your staff. So yeah, I would say be flexible, like Dylan's saying. That doesn't mean be flexible with expectations. It means be flexible with working hours. If someone comes on your staff, have a conversation of what it looks like for them. And just because it looks like something for one person doesn't mean it has to look like something for the next person. It doesn't, I mean, we all want everything to be fair and equal, but that's just not what life is. Not everyone at just about literally any job I've ever worked at has had the exact same working hours. That's just the way it is. And so if you want women and if you want mothers and if you want women and not just women who are single and not student, there's a very, very small specific subsection of people that would fit into it if you had said it has to be these hours. But if you're willing to be flexible, you open yourself up to a lot more people in your congregation that maybe want to do more, but just feel like they can't because they're not available at office hours.
Yeah. And I'm not, me personally, like I don't really care much about precedent or what other people are doing in the sense of like every situation is unique. And so maybe you want most of your people. So like for us, our expectation for staff is Monday and Wednesday you are here at the building at some point, just so that we're all here together. Now, Brittany's not technically full-time, but she also does not have that expectation.
Yeah.
And I don't have our staff they don't care. I mean, they get it. But even if someone had a problem with it, I would say, if it's unfair, it's unfair. But that's just that is our expectation. If you have a kid, then you get to have different rules applied to you.
Sure, yeah.
And it might not be fair because you wish you could have done that, but that's just because this is important to us. That's just what we do. And so,
and it would be different if, Brittany, in this example, my wife, if there was this lesser expectation of time in the office, but also work wasn't getting done.
Right.
That would be a different story. And then what do we got to do about that and things like that? But if you have someone that's willing to still get work done, willing to work it in, and honestly, it's harder to work in, it's harder, I don't know, my opinion, it's harder for that person to work it in around naps and at nights than it is for me to come in the office. It's easy for me. Yeah. So I think that it's I don't think you're necessarily coddling to one person, but I think that if you have someone who is passionate about the work and wants to get the work done, then having specific office hours is, I don't know, not always the best thing, and may in the long run actually be a hindrance.
Yeah. So, and I think again, as everything is changing, the office hours things is less and less, especially in church world.
Yeah.
But just know that even with those expectations being different, especially if a woman has kids, particularly young kids, their expectations might even be even more different than everyone else, and you just got to be okay with that if you want put more women on your staff. So
yeah, and that's the thing. You can be more rigid, but it will translate into being a male-centric staff. It's just we want to say it won't be, but that's what it'll be in the long run.
Yeah, so be flexible with working hours, not expectations. And then number 5, be clear about what you believe in terms of women in ministry, and then have women participate and fill those roles. So first of all, you should tell your church where do you land on the spectrum?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter for this example. It does not matter where you land. You just need to be honest. So our partnership class, or membership, we call partnership. We tell people, we have a list of 7 or 8 things that are faithful Christians can disagree on, and you can disagree on and be a partner here. But we just want you to know up front so you're not confused or hear something later on and feel like, why didn't nobody tell me this? So, predestination and free will, creation, revelation, the end of the world, divorce and remarriage, women in ministry, and spiritual gifts. I think that's it.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. And faithful Christians can disagree on all those things and still really love Jesus and be a partner here, but we don't want to be surprised. And so what do you believe? And then regardless of what you believe, do you have women who do those things that you are comfortable with in your setting? In my experience, a lot of churches, complementarian or egalitarian, both, have things that they're either women can do everything or maybe just not elder pastor. Both often don't have women doing what they say they can do.
What they're okay with them doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And even in egalitarian churches where it's women can be pastors, whatever, they might have just one and everything else is males.
Yeah.
And so what you're comfortable with, do you have any women doing those things? And again, part of it is stage and size of your church and availability, but it's just, if it's important to you, you should try to be proactive in finding ways to make sure women are involved in these things and not just, they can do it, but no women actually does any of it.
No, that's a good point. And being clear about what you believe, I think, is really important. One thing I've always appreciated is that we don't, it's not something we preach about on Sunday unless, it happens to come up in a passage, but in our partnership or membership, we don't shy away from the fact that we're complementarian. And we have people that come here and have in the past that don't necessarily agree, but I think appreciate that we don't shy away from it. In other words, that it's not you only see men preaching, you only see men elders, and so it's just assumed, but we don't. We're afraid to talk about it. But we are honest and say this is what we believe, and if you disagree, it's not a we're right, you're wrong thing, but we'd love to discuss because this is not just it's not the most cut and dry situation on the planet.
And in our defense, I feel it's a little funny to me. We're complementarian, but we're not afraid to talk about women in leadership, and we actually have women do stuff.
Yes.
That a lot of non-complementarians don't have women do.
Yeah.
So because it matters to us, we want women to be on stage every Sunday and part of Next Steps and leading confession and in serve positions, and we talk about women leadership. I'm not downplaying the disagreement between pastors and elders. I get, that can cause tension and some people might not like that, but there are 4 elders at our church. And technically, I'm the only pastor. That's like, right. So out of everybody, there's only like 5 people. There's only 5 positions right now that everyone else can't do,
right?
Which is such a small percentage of our church.
Yeah.
And so have women do the things that they want to. And I feel like you'll have a lot less pushback if people actually see women doing stuff.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, well, they can do it, but no one actually does it here.
Yeah. No, that's good. Making sure. Yeah. Because I feel like, I mean, we're not egalitarian, but I feel like if I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this, but like, I feel like if we said like we are, men, women, pastors is perfectly fine, but you've never seen a woman preach from our stage, then that's just, I feel like that's almost more damaging than saying that, that the role of pastor in our situation is reserved for men, because I feel like it's pandering. If you say this, but you're not actually willing to do it, then to me it comes across, not that this is not that it's intentionally, but to me it comes across as if you're just saying it to make people happy, but not actually willing to do it. Yeah. And so be clear what you believe, but also be willing to do what you believe. So if you think women should be in every single role, that's not this discussion. Like then do it. Then you should be working towards that and seeing what you can do. If you believe certain roles, then you should be doing those things, but don't say that or say what you believe, but then make sure you're doing what you believe and not just saying it so people will like it. Yeah. So be clear what you believe and then actually do it and find ways to actually, make it happen. Yeah. And talk about it, and that'll, set goals, have ideas of how you're going to do it, get feedback from women so that it can actually happen. And it's not just like we want women to do these things, but they don't do it. If you're the leader, it is on you to try to create spaces. You can't make people show up and do stuff, but you can create avenues and you can be intentional. Like you can ask women to fill needed roles. You can get their feedback, and you can have people in positions to, make it more likely to happen. Yeah. So, there's 5 ways to encourage women in leadership in your church. At the end of the day, it just comes down to intentionality. It's just like growing a church or increasing your finances or becoming more ethnically diverse. Everybody wants these things, but if you don't have a plan, then they're probably not just going to randomly happen. And so, and I would say with this too, if you're not quite sure where you stand on this, you need to figure it out, because people will ask you. And even if they don't actually come out and ask you, they don't know. They want to know. And so wherever you stand on that, especially if you're in like the planting phase, you need to figure it out and you need to tell people. And a partnership membership process is a great non-awkward way to tell people, because it's just like, here's our church, here's what we're doing. But like have it written down and so people actually know what's happening, but then also encourage women to do those things so that you actually have men and women leading and making a difference at your church. Yeah, it's good. So those are 5 ways to encourage women in leadership at your church. Hopefully that was helpful. If you are in the pre-launch phase, make sure you head to practicalplanting.com/launch. Check out our Growing Your Launch Team course. Honestly, we promise that your team will at least double if you go through it. And don't forget faithstreet.com/practical to check Faith Street out as well. And we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting.